thanks for coming, and thanks for streaming, everyone online. This talk, obviously, is about everything announced at WWDC this week. There's lots of stuff that was announced. Obviously, not everything I can cover in this presentation, but I want to cover kind of the most interesting bits, according to me, anyway. I would suggest, if you haven't yet already watched the keynote and the State of the Union, check those out because there's lots of really interesting stuff in there. But this presentation, if I can change my slide, this presentation is aiming to cover essentially kind of a little bit of an overview, just to sort of recap what was announced from the marketing point of view, I suppose you'd say. I also want to get into some of the more technical bits that would be more of interest to us as developers. And I mean, we're still trying to find out these sort of bits and pieces as we go. I mean, I've been following a lot of different tweets this week, finding out new stuff every day, basically, so I'll throw in some of those. I also have my own little controversial take as well. So, as always, with these sorts of events, people are always wondering, well, what's Apple decided to take inspiration from this year, we should say. And, maybe there's a few startups here and there, or bigger companies that might be a little bit upset by some of the changes this year. And Tim will show up a few times in this presentation with his Sherlock hat to point that out. But like I said, there's lots of big changes this year. It kind of feels like a little bit of a catch-up year after last year. I mean, I don't know you guys, but I certainly felt last year was a little bit quieter than normal, maybe because of COVID. It's sort of hard for Apple engineers to, adjust to that lifestyle of working from home, working together. But it definitely feels like they've sort of they've caught up a little bit. They've certainly remembered that SwiftUI exists, and they've really gone all in after a number of small features last year. So we'll start with iOS 16, but it's more than just iOS 16, because most of these features that were sort of announced actually are across all of Apple's platforms. And I guess the biggest question that a lot of us devs would have is, like, when can I actually use this stuff? Because a lot of us will have to support the last couple of versions, iOS 14, 15, when can we update our base version in our app? What devices are we going to lose? So the last couple of versions, we got pretty lucky in that I think every device that could run iOS 13 could also run 14, 15. This year, not quite so lucky. Apple's decided, okay, it's time to cut some stuff, and all these phones are now unsupported for 16. So the iPhone 6S is finally dead, as is the 7. And somehow I was really surprised to see the iPad Air 2 is still around, but that could run 15, but not 16. So keep that in mind if you want to drop old versions. Most obvious front-facing feature that you probably see with iOS this year is new customizable lock screen. Customizable to some extent, not fully customizable. For example, the fonts, I think there's a preset bunch. There's like 6 or something that you can choose from. You can't have Comic Sans as a font. You can pick your tint color. Also, interestingly, is I thought this was actually quite cool. They've got some sort of intelligence with their photos. As you can sort of see, the foreground objects can actually go in front of the numbers, which I think is quite cool. And we sort of see that a little bit later on with some of the other stuff that they've got. They've also got widgets on the lock screen now. What's really interesting about this is that you can create your own widgets. It's not just Apple's stuff that they've got. And, you can make your own in your own apps. Interestingly, it's a new framework as far as I can tell, WidgetKit. You can use the same code across iOS and watchOS, so you can have one sort of widget that you can use everywhere, which is really nice. I wasn't sure, I haven't had time to look into it. I don't know how this affects the existing widgets for home screens at the moment. I don't know if that's like an old deprecated style or something, but maybe if anyone knows, let me know, because I'd be interested, or post in Slack. One of the more interesting things is live activities, which is kind of a persistent notification that just lives around on your lock screen in particular situations. One example I had here was for Uber. So instead of having to unlock your app and see, well, where's my car, how far away it is, you can just sort of get a bit of a quick update on your lock screen and get a general idea of where it is. So that's pretty cool. There's also sports scores as one example that you could do, which when I saw this, I thought this would probably upset a few of those live scores websites, but I guess it's time for them to make an app if they haven't already. They also have more focus stuff this year. So I don't know about you, I'm not personally motivated enough to set up all these focuses. I only use Do Not Disturb, to be honest, because it kind of just felt like a lot of busy work to set up. But I know that if I were to have a work lock screen, I'd definitely be using the classic haha business as my background. But if you use different focuses, you can have multiple lock screens. That's pretty cool. They've also got photo sharing capabilities in iOS, macOS as well this year. So one really cool thing now is when you take a photo, you see this little toggle at the top. You see that shared library. You can toggle that on or off, where you can send photos that you take to your, well, Apple really emphasized family here. You can send it to your family. So it sounds like they don't have multiple shared libraries. As an example, let's say you want to go on a trip with your friends and you want to share all your photos with them. It sounds like unless you consider them family, they're not going to be able to get it. So it's really only sort of one shared library that you get. But what it does do is pretty cool. Like if you take a photo, it will sync to all whoever's in your group. They will get the photo as well, and you'll get theirs. But yeah, maybe iOS 17 will get multiple shared libraries. We'll see. A few new things in messages as well this year. We've got mark as unread and undo send, which is pretty cool. I'm glad that mark as unread is there. Usually for messages that come in, I just 3D touch them to read the notifications, so I don't mark them as read for anyone I don't really feel like talking to right now. And if you can't spell or you often embarrass yourself, you can now undo messages. But I think you only get about 15 minutes to do that. Mail's pretty similar. They've got undo send now. They've got scheduling messages if you wanted to schedule a message for the morning or something. You can also use follow-up, which is a way to get reminded about chasing people if they ignore your messages. A lot of these features are kind of taken from other apps, but I think this is good. The Mail app should have them really. Moving on to sort of more of these intelligence features that I was sort of talking about earlier. A lot of this extends on live text from last year, except there's a lot more smarts. Really, this sort of comes down to how to send dog pictures to your friends, because the example that they took was taking your dog out of photos, just having it automatically outline the dog, and you can copy it, paste it, send that to your friend. It certainly would have made my sloppy photoshopping a lot easier in this presentation if I had that this week, but maybe next year. Also, interestingly, you can copy text out of videos now, which is pretty cool if you pause it. So apart from just copying code from Stack Overflow, you can now copy from YouTube. There's also some more interesting stuff with the live text feature, where you can now tap numbers with units and see the conversion of it in different units. Pretty cool. There's also translations. So that sounds a lot like Google Translate. But I hope you have a new phone, because this stuff doesn't work on an iPhone 10. You need to have a slightly more powerful phone. I think one of the more interesting things that was announced is the feature of passkeys. Apple essentially wants to kill passwords because passwords are terrible. Nobody remembers them. Nobody uses them properly. But what's really interesting with this is that it's not just Apple doing it. It's Microsoft and Google who's also on board. They're building their own implementations for their own respective platforms. This feature will even work on a kludgy Windows laptop. So no more passwords. You can, when you sign up for an account on a website, the system will create a passkey for you, which is a cryptographic key. You don't have to remember anything. This will just get synced to your iCloud account. It essentially eliminates phishing. So your rich uncle from overseas you've never heard of who wants to give you $1 million for your password, you can't even give it to them because you don't have one. It only works on the domain you've signed up on, so those sorts of fake bank websites that look like your bank but aren't, they wouldn't even work because you wouldn't be able to use it. So going back to your kludgy Windows laptop, if you are using, I don't know, a work computer or something and you need to sign into something that uses the passkey and you have everything set up on your iPhone or your Mac, well, all you need to do is scan a QR code on your phone, prove it on your phone, and you're good to go. It'll automatically sign in for you. So I think this is really cool because it has big buy-in from like all the major companies. It's not just Apple. If it was just Apple, I'd be like, oh, that's cool, but it's not really, it just locks you into the ecosystem more. But because everyone else, all the other companies are sort of moving in this direction, I think it has a decent chance of actually taking off. But it will take many, many years. Moving on to Afterpay, or I really should say Apple Pay. Apple Pay Later. Apple Pay now has Apple Pay Later, where you can pay in installments. It sounds like it's just in the US at the moment. I guess eventually it will roll out to other countries. Not sure exactly yet. Not really surprising Apple would expand into this. What was surprising, I read this morning that they're actually doing their own lending and credit checks for this. So they're not involving Goldman Sachs, which they have been doing with Apple Pay before. So I guess they're trying to cut them out and take that over. So more profits for Apple. Apple's building a car. Not really. Just another version of CarPlay that's coming out, or at least that's all they've announced so far. I mean, it kind of looks cool, if you ask me, but also very distracting. Has anyone ever driven a car? Do you really want to be just mashing this screen to try and pause your music or whatever? I understand the proof of concepts, but have they learnt nothing from the touch bar? Where are my buttons, my knobs? Come on. I really like CarPlay, at least the current version of it. I have it in my car, so maybe in 10 years when I buy a new one, maybe I'll have some version of this. So interesting to keep an eye on that. Interestingly, the iPhone will now have, I guess the iPad, actually I'm not sure. I imagine iPad, but it will make sense on iPhone. It has the fitness app now from Apple Watch. You can now close your rings without it. And I know it's probably heresy to say here, but I don't own an Apple Watch, mostly because I just don't like my wrist buzzing every time I get a text message. But I have always been interested in the fitness features, so I'd be interested to try that out. Maybe I'll like it so much I'll buy an Apple Watch. We'll see. But that's cool, that's finally coming across. Now, coming to the Mac, the best way to run Slack and Teams on the same computer. We've got M2 this year, M2 processor. We have two new colors, black and gold. I really like the look of the black. It reminds me of those old plastic Mac laptops from like the mid-2000s. I really miss the black. It supports up to 24 gig of RAM, which is a lot better than 16. Oddly, I found this really odd. They have a new 13-inch MacBook Pro, even though they just announced a 14-inch not that long ago. And you really have to kind of squint to see it, but there is a touch bar there. They really tried to hide it, I think. It's the same design as last year. From what I can tell, it's not anything different. It's literally just replacing the chip. It's the odd one out as far as I can tell. It is cheaper than the 14-inch, so I guess it's kind of like a budget entry point if you want a Pro model with a reasonable amount of RAM. But yeah, you'd be getting the touch bar. And on touch bar, I mean, I don't know about you, I hate it. I mean, I have it on this thing and it drives me nuts. I'm always mashing at it to try and pause my music and go away. I'd be very pleased when it's finally gone. I get my buttons back. I'm not an old man. And in the least original joke in this presentation, and that's saying something, the new macOS is macOS Ventura. And it's actually, like iOS 16, it's cutting a few things as well. I was really surprised to see MacBook Pro from 2015 and 16 are gone, which doesn't feel like that long ago. But apparently, I guess Stage Manager needs the power. I don't know. Yeah, so they're unsupported. And for the stuff of memes and nightmares for Johnny Ive, you can now attach your phone to your Mac as a camera. I don't know if they're trolling us at this point, but like, why don't you just put the decent camera hardware into the Mac? People have been asking for a decent camera in that for years. The new Macs do have a 1080p camera, finally, but I mean, come on, did anyone look at that and be like, yeah, that makes sense, that's cool. It does have a few cool features with, the 3 cameras or however many cameras your phone has, which is quite cool. It can track you when you're standing in front of the camera. So as an example, if I'm standing here, for some weird reason, I decide to walk over here, it will track me. Just stand in front of the computer, like, who's moving around? I don't know. One cool thing, though, is that you can see your desk. When I first saw this, I was like, what? Who's going to be doing card tricks? But I did think about it, this would actually be quite cool for teachers, I suppose, working in lockdown, trying to show kids their work. I guess that's a cool feature. But this does work on FaceTime, Teams, Zoom, whatever app you use. It's not just a FaceTime thing, but I don't know. It feels to me, maybe I'm just grumpy, but I feel like this team has too much time on their hands, honestly. Like, come on. New macOS also has this new thing called Stage Manager, which looks a lot like Mission Control. I don't really know what the difference is. You've kind of got 2 docks now as opposed to 1, and you've got spaces, and it's just Mission Control, but different. I don't know. It's on the iPad, which I think makes sense here because we don't have Mission Control, but I guess they want to make it, have one and have it on the other. Makes sense, I guess, but anyway. Also on iPad, you now have overlapping windows for the first time, and you can resize them. So essentially, Apple's adding a whole bunch of features to the iPad to make it feel more like a Mac, to get those Mac users by an iPad. And with that in mind, they also have now external display support, which is kind of cool. But I hope you have an M1 iPad, because none of this will work on any of the other iPads. So I hope you didn't buy an iPad mini 6 months ago, because you are out of luck. And speaking of bringing Mac-like things to the iPad, the Files app has a few other features, not really that exciting, but things that should have been there. You can view folder sizes and change file extensions. So, really, really revolutionary stuff. Even more revolutionary, weather after 12 years finally comes to the iPad. Yes. Thank you, Apple. Finally. Still no calculator, though, so hope you don't want to add numbers together. Most interesting bit here is that this weather data is available through a new framework called WeatherKit, which is being covered in the next presentation, I believe, so I won't go into that too much. Weather data, I saw, supposedly does include some Bureau of Meteorology data. I don't know what that means exactly, whether that's just for satellite. I was always been a bit worried about this app in that, it's never really that accurate for Australia, but we'll see. Hopefully it's better this year. So a lot more stuff that was covered in the keynote and State of the Union, but that's kind of the high-level important stuff, I guess, that I would, probably say most interesting. So I want to get a little bit more, developer-centric here. So that was a very quick overview. Most interesting thing for me I saw in the State of the Union was Apple's, like I said, remembered SwiftUI exists, and they really want people to use it now, which I think is good. It works for me because the app I work on is in SwiftUI, so I really had no interest in trying to remember how to do self-sizing collection view cells. It was always really difficult, and I would always forget how to do it. And I didn't even need to anyway, because they added it to UIKit. It's like, come on, I've been waiting for this since iOS 10, and now you don't even need to bother with it. They also have an interesting UI collection view cell where you can just inline SwiftUI code. So if you haven't looked at it too much, now you can start progressively implementing it, which is pretty cool. I think if you want to start implementing SwiftUI in a UIKit heavy app, collection view cell, table view cell, probably a good place to start. So really the biggest thing this year, I would say, is that they've really tried to plug a lot of the holes in SwiftUI, and there were a lot, particularly on macOS. It was feeling pretty neglected, I would say. Even iOS was missing a lot of things from UIKit that just hadn't been ported across, so we needed a whole bunch of wrappers to get it. But a lot of those sorts of things have been sort of improved and fixed. We have a few things here. I'll just very quickly run through them. To start with, NavigationStack, which is a complete replacement of Navigation View. Navigation View is now deprecated. Interestingly, they want to allow programmatic navigation, so essentially allowing you to very easily support deep linking. Like if you receive a push notification, you tap it and you want to go to a specific screen, it's now a lot easier to do that by just using this navigation destination method or modifier. And they've also got they allow full access to the navigation stack as well, which is really helpful. Let's say you want to have a button that takes you back to the start of the app, or say you log out, you just want to clear the stack. Much easier. We finally get split view on iPad, which was one of the missing bits from UIKit that we didn't have. 2 or 3 column layouts is supported. We also have share sheets, which is, I actually didn't even realize this was missing from iOS, but it's good that it's there. You just would have had to do a wrapper before in UIKit, a UIKit wrapper in SwiftUI. Mac also gets Windows, so you can make an app that actually feels like a Mac app. You also get menu bar items, so lots of stuff that makes SwiftUI usable on a Mac, really. Swift Charts is a new framework, which again I think is covered in the next presentation, so I'll just give you a very brief overview. You can get lots of very pretty looking graphs, no more third-party libraries to do all this stuff, and only a very small amount of code to do that. This looks really cool. You get all the animation for free, looks very nice. Yeah, looking forward to trying that one out. So yeah, lots of good stuff this year. I'd suggest checking out some of the videos on SwiftUI for a bit more detail. Now, this is my controversial rant at this point, which I prefaced at the start. As good as this all is, it's not all rosy because it's still tied to OS releases. I don't know about you, but like the apps I work on, I still support iOS 14, 15. Maybe by the time 16 comes out, we'll drop 14. But still, I'm not going to be able to use this stuff when it comes out immediately. Now, this is one little feature that has really bugged me in particular. So the bottom sheet. They actually added it to UIKit last year as an official Apple thing. They had it in apps, like the Maps app, for ages, and you're like looking at it, I'm like, how do I get that? I want that. They added it to UIKit last year. Didn't bother to make a SwiftUI version. A whole other year later, we finally get the SwiftUI version. If you haven't seen it, it's just this little bottom sheet that you can slide up and you get a more detailed view. Anyway, I use this in quite a few spots in my app, and at least with what they've added in SwiftUI this year, very simple, only a very small, very few number of lines of code to do it, very easy, awesome if you're just using iOS 16. To give my own app a little bit of a plug here, I work at AndroidX. We have our own bottom sheet implementation. We support iOS 14 as a base. We made this ourselves, the bottom sheet there. Now, let's say I want to migrate from our version to Apple's version. And like I said, maybe I'll move to 16, but maybe not immediately. We'll probably support 14 for maybe a few months after 16 comes out. So what do I need to do? On iOS 14, I need to support my custom version. iOS 15, I can use Apple's version, but I have to wrap that UIKit version in some SwiftUI wrapper. And on 16, I can finally use the native version in SwiftUI. So that's three implementations for essentially the same feature. Fair bit of fragmentation, I'd say. A lot of fragmentation. Where do we always hear fragmentation? People always reference Android when we hear fragmentation, because there was always, Samsung would have some, weird version of Android that they modified, and, Android users never get to update. They're always like, 10% of users have the latest version of Android. But Google has actually done, from the developer experience, has done a lot in the last few years to address this. And I would say that they're actually doing it better than Apple is. Google's OS adoption is still terrible, but in terms of developer APIs, like a lot of it is in a shared library now. It's completely separate from the operating system. So what Google has is AndroidX. They have this set of libraries that are completely separate from the OS. So when they want to release some sort of new feature that really has no business being tied to the OS, they can just throw it out there and let people use it. They're updated frequently. A number of channels, like you see, there's like stable channel, beta, alpha, etc. Just as an example, these dates here are just the releases for Jetpack Compose this year. Jetpack Compose being the SwiftUI equivalent for Android, either alpha, beta, or release. And for things that aren't quite ready for release, they have a separate library to that library called Accompanist, where it's kind of like a lab-like environment where they'll play with things and see what works, what doesn't, and sort of get consensus on, is this good enough to finally go into Compose? And when it is, they add it and take it out of the library. So you'll see at the bottom there, insets, they developed that within this library, took it out, and then put it into Compose. Now, maybe this is controversial. I don't think Android is fragmented anymore. I think iOS is. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love developing on Apple platforms. I would much rather be a full-time Apple engineer than an Android. But Apple needs to do more. I think not every feature should be available on every old version. I don't think anyone expects that. But why can't some silly view update bottom sheet that's really just a different kind of modal be available? Why do we have to wait 2 years before we can use that? It's silly. Why don't they make it like Swift? Even Swift concurrency works going back to iOS 13. They tie it to Xcode releases. You get a new Xcode release, you can use the new stuff, the old version. It just works. Why isn't SwiftUI like this? I wish this was one thing that Apple would Sherlock. Give me a shared library. So that's me on my high horse. I'll come down now. Thank you for not booing. So moving on, I just want to finish up very quickly. It's a state of the tweets. Twitter, I find, is the best place to get all the good news and WWDC from all the people who dig through all this stuff and post what they find. So here's a few quick things I found. So when an app tried to access your pasteboard in iOS 15, you get that little toast at the top. Commonly see that on Facebook. Now on iOS 16, you have to actually give the app permission. So suck it, Zuckerberg. Apparently, Xcode has a new tool to help reveal what parts of your compilation takes the longest. So if you have, a file that is not written in a way that the compiler likes, it takes, a few seconds longer than you'd expect to compile, you can now see it in a nice graph. So that's pretty cool. There's also new human interface guidelines, which is really nice. So check that out, send it to your designer. This is a little bit sad. I don't know whether people like skeuomorphism or not, but this is one of the last things that's sort of stuck around, but there's no page curl animation anymore. It's, you now read from a deck of cards. If I can replay that. No, go back. Sorry, I've skipped ahead. Okay, I've got to stop clicking. Sorry. Should have looped that video. All right, as you can see, we're reading from a deck of cards rather than page flipping. So a little bit sad. Interestingly, SwiftUI's implementation of a list no longer uses UI table view behind it, apparently. So maybe I can embed it into a scroll view now without it breaking. Maybe. I haven't tried it yet.
By born.
What have they done to my beautiful pie? No need to repeat yourself when unwrapping in Swift 5.7. You can just cut the bit off if wet now, which is nice. And I didn't expect this one. Bitcode is going away. Haven't looked into this too much yet, but apparently, yeah, Bitcode's dead. So there you go. So thanks for coming, everyone. Hope you learned some things, and yeah, thanks.